This video is brought to you by patreon.com/worsttake. Get access to exclusive live streams and Discord servers, on-screen shoutouts, and early access to some videos when you join now. Help make sure that we can continue to make content like this by supporting the Patreon. Links are in the description down below. Hey, what's up, and welcome to Q&A, the show where I take your questions from YouTube and answer them here in video format. Ton of questions to get into, so let's just jump into it. And we're going to start with the first question of the day from Adam. And Adam says, looks like the Cap raised $30 million for this season. Do you think this is a large raise, or this large raise changes how many free agents the Browns approach? I don't know if it really changes the Browns' approach. I think it changes the perspective from like the outside looking in. But those of us who have been following the Browns' salary cap situation kind of know that the Browns have been preparing for stuff like this to happen. The way that the Browns structure their cap, and the reason why restructuring Deshaun Watsons' contract and kicking that money down the line makes more sense for the Cleveland Browns, is because the Cleveland Browns, like a lot of other teams in the NFL, operate off of the assumption that the salary cap is going to continue to rise. So while you might see some panic like you saw this week when people look at the cap and be like, oh, the Browns are -19 in the cap, oh my goodness, what are they going to do about that? It's not really that big of a deal because they know that the cap's going to go up at the start of the new league year. It usually goes up 7 to 8%. This year it went up 13.5%. So it's working 4 points above what they plan for. But I don't know if that really changes what their operating budget for free agents is going to be. I tend to think they're going to work within about a $30 million range in bringing in new players. For this year, I would expect them to be heavy in the one-year deals if those become available. And I think they're still going to be, they're going to be aggressive, but still economical about their aggressiveness. The Browns have a ton of returning players. They really are returning every key starter from the team. So there's not like a key starter that you have to bring in. They've already handled most of that stuff with extending Grant Delpit. So they're in a good spot. They have all the players that they want right now. They can add to it with some guys here or there. But yeah, the Browns are in a pretty good spot. I don't know if this changes it, just because the Browns have been preparing for this. And next year you'll see something similar where people might panic about the cap, but the Browns are working off an assumption. They use like cap rollover and all these other mechanisms to kind of make sure that they stay flexible like they've been the last few years. So hats off to Andrew Berry. This is just him doing his job well, and hats off to the Browns salary cap team for being able to anticipate things like this and be able to be confident enough in their projections to be able to build build a good salary cap situation off of it. The next question comes from Iceman the Boss, who says, I don't know if you watched the Andrew Luck documentary podcast by The Athletic, but I find similarities to Luck's play style and Watson's striking and scary. Do you think Watson is aware of the changes that are needed? I've brought this up before, right? And this is something that I do find to be interesting. Andrew Luck, Carson Wentz, Cam Newton, all three guys who have a play style that kind of put them in the warrior category, right? They take a lot of hits. They're really physical. They're not like most quarterbacks who are looking to protect themselves first. They're looking for that trouble. And that quarterback is really fun in their early 20s, right? You look at most of the best stuff with Carson Wentz, early career when he first got drafted out of North Dakota State. You look at Cam Newton. By the time he turned 30, he wasn't really useful. And then you look at Andrew Luck, by the time he turned 30, he took so much punishment that he retired. So there's definitely a concern about playing that way. It's funny to me because we don't really have a good grasp on what quarterbacks fit this style of play and what quarterbacks don't, right? Deshaun Watson fits that style of play. Andrew Luck is similar to that. And then like Josh Allen is another guy who's similar to that. But like sometimes like we'll lump in like a Lamar Jackson. When Lamar Jackson really don't play like that, he kind of is really good about avoiding taking big hits. But Yeah, that's a big concern for Deshaun, right? Other quarterbacks have made those adjustments. Big Ben was somebody who used to play in a little bit more of a physically reckless way and kind of had to adjust out of it. Brett Favre is also somebody who played physically reckless and adjusted out of it. Uh, Aaron Rodgers is somebody who did that. Like, it's possible to make those adjustments, but it does take a concerted effort. And what we know is that at some point, playing the way that Deshaun Watson did in his early 20s in Houston is something that's going to cause his body to break down in his mid 30s. So it's something you do have to be concerned about. And if you're Deshaun Watson, I do think this is something you have to actively watch for, because it could be that Deshaun Watson gives you a great MVP caliber year this year, but what you get after that might be crickets, right? It's about protecting your body, making sure your body can last. And right now, my biggest concern with Deshaun Watson is that I don't think his health has been as big as a priority as him, proving his toughness on the football field. Chamrod says, you are Andrew Berry. You have three position groups: wide receiver, defensive line, and you have to choose which group you would address in agency, draft, trade for. What would added the cap is set about 255. It's a little bit different now when you add in cash stuff and all the other stuff, accelerators. But Browns have three position groups: wide receiver, defensive line, offensive line. Offensive line, I don't think you have any immediate needs there, so you can be fine with doing that in the draft. Wide receiver, I think you can get somebody, on a value kind of prove it deal to fill the need that you have at wide receiver, which is somebody who could be another playmaker. So like maybe a Mike Williams or something like that. Defensive line is where I would go and spend the bulk of the money, because I think that's where the heart of the team is. If you get the defensive line overpowered, I think your defense is going to be overpowered. And I think in turn, the Browns will be overpowered. So if I had to dedicate a disproportionate amount of money to one position, it would probably be defensive line, in my opinion. My guy War Ready says, do you think y'all finally get a viable linebacker sidekick for JOK? And what's the plan for the defensive line? It's going to be interesting to see what they're going to do with JOK, because now that they're moving him to Mike, or they moved him to Mike towards the end of the season, he might be in a role where it's not like Pat Queen in Baltimore, where Pat Queen kind of gets to do the flashy stuff while Roquan does the dirty work. For JOK, it might be a situation of where he's playing off of the attention that Miles gets, and they kind of use him as a weapon, and then have like other guys kind of just sit back and funnel. So I think there's a lot of different ways they can use JOK. I don't know if they try and go get a sidekick. This regime has not been one that values the traditional linebacker that much. I don't see that changing. As far as the plan for defensive line, I think they're going to go after a DJ Reader. I think they're gonna go after a Chris Jones or somebody. Like, they're gonna shoot high and try to get some big names in here, or at least some guys who are proven chaos creators on the defensive line. I think they're gonna value guys who can win two-way goals, one-on-ones, more than they're gonna prioritize run stuffers. And I think that's going to be the plan going forward. I think they're just trying to figure out how to get to the quarterback as fast as possible, even if Miles is triple teamed. I think that's going to kind of guide everything. Mr. Anderson says, was JOK a top 5 linebacker this year? Most tackles for loss, and the highest is like 20 edge/D line players. JOK was most certainly impressive. The issue with linebacker is the ambiguity of the position, right? We call a bunch of different roles on a football team a linebacker. And we kind of just give them that blanket term of a linebacker, when there are very different responsibilities depending on what kind of defense you're in. We all know the 3-4, 4-3 difference of what a linebacker is, right? Where an edge rusher is technically classified as a outside linebacker, which puts them in the linebacker tier, not a defensive lineman. But on top of that, right, even just when you look at the stand-up linebacker positions, Within that, you have Mike linebackers, you have Will linebackers, you have Sam linebackers. In some defenses, those linebackers have different responsibilities. You look at like how Baltimore uses their two linebackers is something I mentioned earlier in the video, where Roquan is kind of the guy that putting the pieces in place, kind of putting the chess pieces there, but he's not really asked to play make, which is the strength of Pat Queen, who's kind of put in the position to play make. JOK is a little bit of a different one, where he's going to be asked to kind of be the captain of the defense, as far as like getting everybody there, wearing the green dot, but also going to be asked to play make a lot too, as your 20 TFLs kind of indicate. So I think the position, it's hard to say what is a top 5 linebacker, because if we go by playmaking stuff, JOK's in that conversation. But also if we go by playmaking stuff, you end up with the conclusion that like Pat Queen is better than Fred Warner, right? When that's not necessarily the case. So it really just, it's one of those things that's hard to quantify and hard to put in the top 5. What I will say is that JOK is one of the most important parts of this Browns defense going forward, not on the defensive line, and that makes him a very vital piece to the picture. So I don't know if I could quantify it into a top 5 conversation, but I think that you can talk about it in terms of what's his importance to this team and to this franchise, and I think it's significant. Ian says, how do you think the massive cap space increase will affect the Browns' decisions in free agency, and does this change things thought to already be decided? Again, it depends on where you're coming from. If you've been listening to me about the cap situation, I don't think much changes. We haven't been doing much cap panicking over here. But if you were one of those people who was worried about Nick Chubb getting cut, or maybe David Njoku getting cut or something like that, then you're where we're at, right? The Browns are gonna be able to bring back every important starter that they want to bring back. And even some guys, some role players too. Like they'll be able to run it back with whoever they want to and add on top of that. That's kind of the situation that the Browns are in. Going forward, my guy Nick says, given that reports about Chubb being a cap casualty were thrown out, who do you see? There were never reports about Chubb being a cap casualty, by the way. This is one of those things where somebody writes it in an article, then somebody else picks it up because it was written in an article, and then they report on it as if that article was not an opinion, but they report on it as if it was a report, which makes it sound like a report that somebody else reports off the reported article. And it's all this, like, it's how one person's opinion becomes a report, is basically people are trying to write about things and frame them as a report to give them more legitimacy, to make people click on them. But it was never a report. The Browns were never considering cutting Nick Chubb. I thought that was obvious the way they talked about him in the postseason press conference. But nonetheless, Chubb being a cap casualty was thrown out. Who do you think see as the Browns' backup this year? Obviously, Ford took some good steps. I don't think he's ready yet, and I think the Browns increased salary cap. Do you think that they'll be adding? I think they'll go out and add a veteran. I think that's always been part of the plan for the free agency period, to go out and add a veteran. I think they'll try to get a Zach Moss or somebody along those lines, maybe a Devin Singletary, because also it's not a guarantee that Nick Chubb's going to be ready to carry a full workload week 1 of the NFL season. So you want to be able to split carries, and I think you want a veteran to do that, especially given the uncertainty that you have with when Nick Chubb will be at full strength for this year. You expect him to be at full strength at some point during the year, but you also kind of anticipate that there's going to be parts of the year where you got to kind of manage that injury. So that means less snaps for Nick Chubb overall, which means you're going to want to upgrade the backup that you're going to have in there. And I think Jerome Ford's at a good place where he could be a every once in a while back. And be very useful for this team, especially if he's playing off of 2 better backs. But I don't think he's ready to be the backup just yet. Next question comes from Skizzlers, who says, are we officially on Mike Evans / Chris Jones watch now that the cap numbers have come out? I don't think the cap numbers really change where the Browns are with these two. I think they are where they always been. The Browns will become players for Mike Evans and Chris Jones, in my opinion, if they don't get the long-term money that they want, right? So if Chris Jones wants a 4-year deal worth $25 million a year, he's not going to get a $100 million deal from the Cleveland Browns over 4. That's not going to happen. But if Chris Jones can't get close to that money or can't get that money, and he starts thinking, okay, I want to re-enter the market and go on a prove-it deal, a 1-year deal, then the Browns become a big player in Chris Jones. The same thing applies for Mike Evans. If Mike Evans is looking for a 4-year deal, I don't think the Browns give it to him. If Mike Evans is looking for a 1-year deal, I think the Browns are in the perfect position to give it to him. So with some of these bigger names that are going to be in free agency, the question is, will they get the money that they want, and what position will that put them in going forward? Will they take less money on a long-term deal, or will they be willing to take a short-term deal to re-enter the market as soon as possible? And then if that's the case, Cleveland becomes a really attractive option for those guys. My guy Jacoby Brissett, the fake Jacoby Brissett, says, looking at the safety room for 2024, do you think both Hickman and Bell are roster locks from their strong play last year? Or do you think this is a chance that we draft the safety to fill a fifth spot? Or do you think we go out and get a veteran like McLeod, round it out? I think they're happy with their safety room. I think they'll probably run it back. Maybe they bring back McLeod, or maybe they don't. If they don't bring back McLeod, they'll probably just draft somebody. But you got a lot of youth in that room already, so I wouldn't be surprised if they brought McLeod back, to be honest with you. But that's going to be it for this week's Q&A. I really do appreciate every single one of you joining me for this show and asking these questions. Y'all have a great day. Have an even better night. Peace.